Hello everybody, welcome to today's video. Today is part 2 of Squabbles, Spats, and Such. Recap of the Bible verse, Proverbs chapter 10 verses 12 to 13. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers all wrongs. Wisdom is found on the lips of the discerning. So we already had gone through the first part. Now we're going to get into the second part. An ancient reality show. The story of Joseph and his family has always fascinated me. The saga of his family in Genesis 37 to 50 plays out almost like an ancient reality show. And I am simply in awe of the ways that Joseph uses both his words and his silence for good. He did it when he interacted with his family members, and he did it when he interacted with those he encountered in the workplace. Let's take a little peek at the story now. Joseph's father Jacob had a couple of wives and a boatload of kids. Even though I'm sure the popular self-help books of his day told him not to, he had a favorite child. This child was Joseph, who had been born to his wife Rachel. Jacob even had a nifty coat of numerous colors specifically crafted for Joseph, who must have paraded this prized piece from his papa in front of his brothers enough that it made them very jealous. To make matters worse, Joseph was starting to have big, self-important dreams. When he awoke, he shared what he dreamt with his older brothers, even when his dreams suggested all of his siblings would one day bow down to him. While that is indeed what eventually happens, you can imagine that sharing all the details of these dreams didn't win Joseph any Brother of the Year awards from his siblings. Instead, they hated him all the more. In fact, his brothers could not even stand the sight of him. Whenever he came upon them out in the fields, they uttered under their breath, "Here comes that dreamer." One day, when his brothers had gone out to pasture their father's flock at Shechem, their dad sent Joseph to see how they were doing and then bring word back to him. After searching for a while and asking a man out in the field where he might find them, Joseph stumbled upon his brothers at Dothan. Instead of being excited to see their brother and extending the family high five and handshake, they decided to do away with him, murder their own flesh and blood. However, Big Brother Reuben spoke up and said, "Let's not take his life. Let's throw him into a pit instead." He intended later to come back and rescue him and return him to their father. And so into the dry cistern Joseph was tossed. Another little Joe, picked on by his big brothers. Later, the boys pulled him out of the pit and came up with a different plan. They decided to turn a little profit on the whole shady deal by selling him to a group of Ishmaelite traders who were headed down to Egypt. Then they returned home and told their father that Joseph had been killed by wild animals, providing his once colorful but now blood-soaked garment as proof of the tragedy. Jacob was distraught beyond belief. Joseph, once a favored son, was now a slave in the house of Potiphar. This man was a well-to-do official in the land of Egypt. He had a big house and nice things. He also had a very flirtatious wife who set her sights on the young and hunky Joe. I've always thought of her as the first desperate housewife. Although I've never watched that show, I think the housewives usually seduce the pool guy or some other unsuspecting and inappropriate male. And this is precisely how we see Mrs. Potiphar behaving. When one day she finds Joseph all alone, Mrs. P approaches him with a lusty request. "Come to bed with me." Joseph, who fears God and wants to honor him even though he is now in a strange land, does not sin with his words. Instead, he plainly states the truth to his boss's wayward wife. With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me, except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" In using his words to answer this seductress, Joseph not only honors his boss, but he also honors his God. He answers her in accordance with what is right, both as an employee and as someone who follows the one true God. Joseph had a choice to make. He could have chosen to use his words for evil. He could have accepted her advances so as not to offend her and had an immoral relationship with her. Then he could have continued to use his words to cover up the deed, making sure his master never found out about it. And if confronted, he could have lied about the incident. But because Joseph chose to speak the truth from the beginning, he didn't have to continue to use deceitful words to cover up poor choices. However, even good and true words have consequences. Mrs. Potiphar, who didn't consider her advances as immoral, or didn't consider her advances an immoral mess, engaged her lying tongue to spread the story that Joseph tried to rape her. Joseph was summarily thrown out, not into a dry cistern this time, but into the Pharaoh's prison. Once behind bars, the plot only thickens. Joseph meets up with a couple of new characters. One is the chief cupbearer for Pharaoh, and the second is his baker. When both men have dreams they can't understand, Joseph interprets for them. Cat's freaking out. For one man, it turns out grand. The cupbearer is released in 3 days and goes back to his old job. However, the baker doesn't get such a joyful interpretation. Instead, he is put to death after 3 days. Joseph asks the cupbearer to remember him when he goes back to serve Pharaoh. Unfortunately, the cupbearer is so excited to be bearing cups again, he plumb forgets about Joseph. Later, however, when Pharaoh himself is tormented by dreams that include fat cows and skinny cows, the cupbearer suddenly remembers the clever guy in prison who could make sense of bizarre dreams. Joseph is summoned. The dreams are interpreted. Pharaoh discovers through Joseph's words that there will be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Joseph's advice? Pharaoh must find a discerning, wise man and set him over all of the affairs of Egypt, saving up food during the years of abundance to make sure they have plenty to go around in the years of famine. Well, who better to be in charge of such a plan than Joseph? He soon enters the service of the king, with a whole administration under his command. He marries and has 2 sons just before the famine arrives. Circumstances finally seem to be going his way. Meanwhile, back in his hometown, Joseph's family is quickly running out of bread and milk, and probably figs and dates too. Upon learning that there is grain in Egypt, Jacob turns to his sons and says, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So all of the brothers, minus the youngest, Benjamin, trek off to Egypt in search of a little grub. When they come before Joseph, he immediately recognizes them. They, however, haven't a clue who he is. By this time, years have passed. His looks have changed, and he dresses and speaks as an Egyptian, not as one of them. Joseph decides to help his brothers, but not without testing them first. Of course, over over the course of time, they travel back and forth between Egypt and their homeland and eventually fetch Benjamin. When Joseph discerns that they are being honest with him and dealing properly, he finally reveals who he is. He sends all of the servants out of the room and weeps loudly as he reveals his true identity to his brothers. The first question on his lips is my father still living? The brothers are so terrified they can't respond. They're sure Joseph will kill them for their treachery. But instead of retaliating, Joseph assures his brothers they have nothing to worry about. They shouldn't even be angry with themselves for selling him into slavery, because Joseph is certain God sent him to Egypt instead of his family to preserve their lives. The entire brood is then reunited, and Jacob gets to see the son he presumed was dead. It seems like a happy ending to a fierce family feud. Joseph provides his family with land to settle in, and they begin to make a living once again. However, years later, when their father dies, the band of brothers is afraid that Joseph has only been biding his time, faking forgiveness for the sake of their father, and now he's going to let them have it. After Jacob's funeral and burial, the brothers go to Joseph and plead, "We are your slaves." They send a messenger to ask Joseph to please forgive their transgressions and all the suffering they caused. He could have had them executed or enslaved, but instead, Joseph responds with compassion. "Don't be afraid," he says. "Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he continued to reassure them and speak kindly to them. And then, just like a classic episode of Bonanza, Old East rather than Old West style, well, they actually do live happily ever after. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of chapter 2. And we will go into part 3 of chapter 2 tomorrow. So I hope you've all had a very wonderful day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!